Hello and welcome to Series 4 of the Lawyers Coach podcast. My name is Oliver Hansard, and each episode of this podcast will feature myself or Claire Rason, both of us coaches and former lawyers, trying to find out what makes lawyers tick. We will be hearing from various guests and experts, and then at the end of each episode, we will both be reflecting on what they said. The Lawyers Coach podcast is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. In this episode, Claire Rason is talking to Colin Levy, a corporate lawyer and legal tech evangelist. They talk about the subject and how lawyers need to adapt to keep up with the fast-changing landscape. Claire starts by asking Colin what attracted him to law in the first place.
So, I love that question. I became a lawyer because I saw being a lawyer as a means of bringing a variety of things that I feel passionate about together, namely writing, speaking, negotiating, and putting puzzle pieces together. Because the law and a lot of what I've done as a lawyer in terms of drafting, negotiating contracts is really a matter of figuring out how to make all these different pieces work together as one coherent whole. And so that really is what drew me to the law, and I've been, haven't regretted it since I joined.
So it's met your expectations in terms of all of those puzzle pieces?
Yes, it has. It has let me down in other ways, but it has certainly met that expectation.
Okay, you can't say that without going into why it's let you down.
Well, I would say that the contrived competition in law school, the lack of adoption of technology has been a bit of a letdown, although not entirely unexpected. And I think that the struggle to try to get more widespread adoption of tech has been, when I first started talking about tech, was harder than I anticipated. Partly because I think so many lawyers are so kind of tied to how things have been done for a long time, and also, quite frankly, how they've been taught to do things.
You're passionate about legal tech, and we'll talk a lot more about that. When did you start talking about it? When did you start realizing it was a problem? Was it right at the beginning of your legal journey?
So it was fairly early on that I realized it was an issue, because one of the first jobs I had was working for a legal startup company developing a in-house contract management and review tool. And we had one customer, but it was hard to get traction with others. And that's when I first got a glimpse of the difficulty in getting tech to be adopted. And I also saw it, quite frankly, when I worked for a big law firm prior to law school as a paralegal, where I was creating litigation e-discovery databases using technology. And the lawyers didn't really care about how it was getting done or how the tool worked at all. All they cared about was just that it needed to get done and they needed to access it.
So do you think that things have moved on since that early experience, or do you think that law firms are still very much in that mindset?
Oh, absolutely. I think things definitely have changed quite dramatically since those early days in my experience as a lawyer. However, I do think that there still remains a great deal of resistance to technology, and also a great deal of fear about technology in terms of its impacts upon the practice of law and on what lawyers will be doing as lawyers going forward over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years.
And I suspect, kind of not wanting to put words in your mouth, but I suspect part of that fear is this idea of machine taking over from people and being able to do some of the things that hitherto perhaps lawyers have done. Do you see that as kind of the main barrier, or do you think there's something else?
So I think that is one factor of many driving fear of tech. I think another driver of the fear is not understanding technology and fearing that you have to learn how to code, or you have to be some kind of tech genius to use technology effectively in your practice. That's another, I think, key driver. And that in part actually precipitated me doing much of what I do in the legal tech space in terms of speaking and writing and advocating for legal tech.
And when you talk about legal tech, what do you mean? Because obviously technology is huge, and certain things are very much specific to the legal industry. And that's something I want to explore with you in a second, whether it's technology at large that lawyers are bad with, or whether it's specific legal tech. But when you talk about legal tech, what do you mean?
So that, I think, is actually another factor driving a bit of a slow adoption of tech in some circles, because people don't really know how to define legal tech. So the way I would define it would be as a few things. Number one is technology that can help you do more with less, be more productive, be more efficient. So if I'm talking about example tools like contract management tools that can help you review agreements, tools that can help you manage matters or help you collaborate better, or tools that can help predict the outcome of potential litigations in court. So that's one part of legal tech. Another part of legal tech is making better use of your existing tools. For example, Microsoft Word, Excel, Outlook, because I think a lot of people use these tools every day, but probably only use 1% of its overall functionality. And so I see another part of legal tech as being about making better use of those tools. And the third sort of element, I would say, of legal tech is really a growing movement to kind of rethink about how we practice law, what it means to practice law, and to be more data-driven and client-focused, as opposed to being insular and focusing only on ourselves and those of us who are members of the legal profession.
Lots of interesting places I can go there. I think I'm going to hone in on the last bit there about being client-focused. What are you seeing clients asking for from their law firms? Do you see that that's kind of driving change?
So I do think that clients remain a key driver of change within the industry, because the legal industry, like any other industry, is a business. And so they want to make the people who are making the business run and succeed, which are the clients, they want to listen to those concerns. So I do think that clients are driving change through kind of clients often are more knowledgeable about existing technologies than the lawyers are, or the firms or departments. I also think that clients are definitely more attuned to cost in terms of how they're paying for legal services. And quite frankly, some clients also are more knowledgeable about how legal services are performed, and therefore understand that if they're asking for something to be done that they know other friends of theirs have asked to be done, it doesn't require a reinventing of the wheel. It just requires simply taking an existing template, for example, and tweaking it, which doesn't require a boatload of hours. And so it shouldn't be as costly as it might have been in the past to do.
Which firms do you think are responding best to the change and the demands?
That's an interesting question. I think it's a difficult one to answer, because it really depends, I would say, on the sector of law that you're interested in. Because there are some big firms that have been very responsive and been very, I think, tech focused. Orc being one of them. I think another being Davis White Tremaine on the west coast of the U.S. There also have been a lot of small firms that have been very tech enabled, partly out of a desire, but also partly out of a necessity, because they just know they need to succeed with little resources, and the best way to do that is using tech to help automate things so that you can spend more time on more productive tasks that are more revenue, more driving in more revenue. I would also say that there are, some medium firms and a lot of departments as well that are definitely adopting tech. So it really depends on kind of the sector you're talking about. But I would say, historically speaking, the smaller law firms and smaller law departments often have been the ones that have been a little more quick on the draw, if you will, with respect to tech, partly out of necessity and partly out of desire.
And you mentioned necessity there, and I think the last 12 months, more than 12 months now with COVID, has really pushed technology up the agenda for all firms, and perhaps opened their eyes to technology which existed before, but perhaps they weren't using. So Zoom, a really good example. Do you think that's given the industry a shake up, or do you think that things are going to quite quickly go back to normal when people go back into the office?
So I get asked this question frequently, and my response is typically the following, which is that I think the pandemic has prompted, I think, an openness that perhaps didn't exist quite so much before to working flexibly, being more open to having people be in different places but working together on the same projects. As to whether the pandemic has facilitated or expedited a quicker adoption of tech, I think that remains to be seen. I do think that there are indications that that is will be the case, but I also think a lot of firms, quite frankly, want to go back to their comfort zone, which has been how they operated before the pandemic. I've already seen reports of law firms saying, "All right, pandemic's over, come back to the office," and I really think that's a bit short-sighted, and strikes me as a bit kind of along the lines of trying to justify having such a big, expensive office space rather than any other desire. But again, it's really early days to say with regards to what impacts have definitively been a result of the pandemic. But I do think the pandemic has certainly opened the doors to thinking about things differently. And certainly, I think, have exposed kind of the power of different technologies in helping people collaborate and work better together.
And I think, my experience from having been in different firms is I think there's definitely a sense with law firms that if it's been tried and tested in another law firm, that's a huge tick in terms of adopting, be it technology or other services. Do you think that kind of mindset of it has to be legal tech to be a technology that we adopt might now shift a bit, and law firms might start to look at solutions that perhaps weren't developed for lawyers but would solve a problem just as well as something that has been?
I want to go back to one thing you said earlier before answering that question, which is with regards to law firms kind of not always wanting to be the first to adopt a piece of technology. I do think that remains the case because it works that way, I think, in a lot of circumstances. Often when people are looking for resources and don't know much about that particular area, they rely on word of mouth from friends, colleagues, family to give them insight. And lawyers are very much the same way. They want to hear from other lawyers. Hey, what are you doing? And oh, maybe we should look at that. With respect to kind of adopting tech and whether it has to be for lawyers, by lawyers, I think that's a bit of a misnomer because I think a lot of legal tech, quite frankly, isn't necessarily best used by lawyers. It's best used by paralegals or by other legal support professionals or legal professionals in general. Oftentimes, the lawyers are but one of many groups that are relying on a piece of technology. For example, contract management tools often are aimed at trying to bring together different functions together: sales, finance, privacy, and lawyers together. So I think that technologies that qualify or that could be called legal tech aren't just those that are designed by lawyers for lawyers. That often seems to be a marketing tactic and a selling point in some ways by some companies. But in my view, that's fine, but that doesn't make me, and I don't think should make anyone else, more or less interested in adopting a piece of tech. Really, it's more about what is this piece of tech solving in terms of what problem is it providing a solution for, and is that the problem that I have?
And it kind of ties into something that I talk a lot about, which is multidisciplinary teams in law firms and expanding the client team beyond just the lawyers. Do you think that tech-minded professionals are going to start to have more of a role in law firms in order to be able to adopt the right technology, the right solutions? Or do you think that that's a dream that's not quite there yet?
I think that's becoming the case. I think that we're seeing more and more collaboration and reliance, quite frankly, on people who understand tech working with lawyers. There are some lawyers who understand tech, but there often are more people who understand tech than there are lawyers who understand tech. So I think there is a growing need for people who can kind of bridge that gap. Like myself, for example, I see myself as being one of those people who can kind of provide a bridge between the two different worlds, which is valuable because often, the lawyers kind of understand their world, but they don't necessarily understand how to translate their world to the tech world or understand kind of what tech they should be looking at to solve whatever problem that they have. So I do think I think that technology certainly has brought on a increased need to work in multidisciplinary ways and learn from one another. And I think, quite frankly, the legal industry overall has very much been in need of more multidisciplinary approaches to doing work, because for too long, I think it was a bunch of lawyers just talking to other lawyers and acting as if they kind of were magicians, part of a guild, when really that's, I think, been a short-sighted way to operate, and also an impediment, I would say, to working effectively in a world that's as dynamic as it's become.
So thinking about skills, which is kind of the theme of this series of podcasts, I'm wondering whether I was going to ask a question around what skills do lawyers need to be able to properly make use of technology, make use of legal tech. What I'm thinking and reflecting on is that what we should be focusing on in terms of upskilling our lawyers so that they become more tech savvy? Or should we be thinking more about, well, what we need to be upskilling our lawyers with are the skills to be able to work in these multidisciplinary teams, so they recognize, actually, this is the strength that I bring to this particular problem, and I recognize that I'm lacking in this area, and therefore the best way of solving that is not to become a lawyer who's good at tech and good at marketing, good at this and good at that. It's actually perhaps what I need to do is be able to know how to bring these in to be able to provide the best solution for my clients.
So to answer your question, what I would say is that it's all of the above. I think, first of all, how we're training law students to be lawyers, we need to be thinking about taking a multidisciplinary approach to that. In other words, we need to be thinking about teaching lawyers how to be good communicators, both in written and spoken form, as well as using technology, as well as being good collaborators. And basically what that means is that we need to be teaching lawyers more about the business world and not just be treating the legal training process as solely about the law, but more about the law and how the law accommodates and works with the greater business world. In addition, I do think that lawyers, can't just stand not doing anything. They always need to be adapting and learning more, because we can't always know everything, and we don't always know everything, and we shouldn't. But that doesn't mean that we can't always be learning new things. And it's really important for lawyers in a dynamic world to be always learning. And so that means upskilling. That means understanding technology. That means understanding the needs of clients of today and what the needs of clients of tomorrow may desire. I also think, quite frankly, that there's a reason why here in the U.S., 39 states have adopted this duty of tech competency, which requires that lawyers understand relevant technologies and their benefits and risks. And really, it's broadly written, but that's partly on purpose, I think, to allow lawyers flexibility to understand what technologies are most pertinent to their practice and most relevant to them, providing the most value, whether it's to their internal clients or external clients.
So for those that are listening outside of the US, could you tell us a little bit more about that and what the duty involves, where it's come from?
Sure. So it was a rule to the model rules of ethics that all lawyers have to agree to. And it basically was a comment to a rule that added in a duty of tech competence, which requires that lawyers be aware of the benefits and risks of relevant technology. And that's partly the exact language of that rule. And it's kind of, it doesn't really say much more than that. So it kind of leaves it up to lawyers to interpret. But ultimately, it really just indicates a need for lawyers to be aware of the technology that exists now and possibly in the future, and how that could be of benefit to their practice, and also the risks involved in using those technologies as well.
And have you seen that shift behaviors in law firms?
I would say that the shift is ongoing. I do think that lawyers are historically slow to change, and they're often, I think, notorious for being notoriously slow to change. But I do think that rule indicates a kind of a more immediate need to start getting with the program, if you will, no pun intended, because technology is not waiting for anything. It doesn't really care whether you are up to date on it or not. It's going to continue to advance, continue to get more complex. And it's up to all of us to try to maintain some degree of pace with technology, because otherwise we're at risk of being left behind and losing out to clients who are expecting us to be well versed in the tools that the clients know can be used to solve their problems.
maybe changing tack slightly and picking up on something you were talking about earlier in terms of smaller firms. And I think sometimes there's a perception, if you're a smaller firm, that you don't have the budgets of the larger firms, that tech is going to be expensive. And I know that's not true across the board. And some small firms are investing heavily in tech and using tech to substitute having to have lots of lawyers or office space. What's your view on this kind of large firm, small firm budget question?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the legal tech world doesn't just consist of enterprise level, expensive, complicated technologies. There are a lot of tools within the legal tech world that often are fairly inexpensive and are loved and well used by smaller law firms and law departments. One company in particular that strikes me as one that's used by many is Clio, which is a practice management software used by many firms of all different sizes. So I think it's a bit of a myth that legal technology is only for the big firms or the big law departments. There certainly are plenty of technologies that get a lot of press and publicity with respect to their impacts for big firms, but there also are tons of technologies that are fairly cheap and often and sometimes even free for use by small firms and small law departments.
I've got two more questions that I want to ask, and one I'm going to use as a follow-on to what we've just been discussing, and that is, if you were talking to a firm who perhaps are just starting out on their legal tech journey, where would you encourage them to start? What's the technology that you would say, this is really where you should, before you start thinking about bigger and bolder solutions, this is really what you need to focus on first?
I would say that you shouldn't be focusing on technology at all if you're starting out on your legal tech journey and you need something. You need to start out with understanding what is the problem you're trying to solve and let that drive your journey into the tech world, because okay, maybe you've got too many contracts and you need some way to manage all of them, or you need some way to manage matters because you have a lot of different matters and email is just a mess, and you need some way to kind of organize and maintain your electronic files. You really kind of have to understand what your need is and then use that as a driver, because otherwise it's easy to get overwhelmed by the number of legal technologies that exist out there that all claim that they can help solve your problem. But you really need to understand thoroughly what your problem is, and also understand sort of the level of comfort you have with technology, and let those two things kind of influence and factor into your decision and what you research with respect to looking at technologies that you potentially want to invest in for your firm.
Another question I have is, you have lots of followers on LinkedIn. And I imagine that lots of those followers are there because of what you talk about, because of legal tech. What is the most common kind of conversation that you get involved with online? What is the thing that you think people are most interested in hearing about?
One of the most common questions I get asked is, how can I learn more about legal tech? How can I connect with the community? How can I get involved? And my answer to that commonly asked question is two things. Number one, start reaching out to people who are doing interesting things in the space, because ask them if they can take a little bit of time to talk to you, because they're more than likely going to be willing to talk to you and wanting to get other people to learn more about what they do. So that's number one. Number two is start following those individuals and commenting on their posts, because that will allow you to have your voice be heard. And also it likely will generate a response from other people. And that way you can start building a conversation with others. And that in turn can lead to the development of relationships. And that's really kind of the strategy that I've taken with developing sort of my community that I'm grateful and honored to be a part of on social media and also offline as well.
And do you see, it's interesting with social media in terms of, I think that I always sound old when I say this, but the younger generations, I think, are grown up with social media and are very comfortable with getting into conversations online. I think that has shifted, and certainly more partner level conversations are now going on online. Do you see a distinction between the people that get into conversations with you? Is there a generational gap?
So I certainly have noticed that folks younger than myself often are way more active on social media. That being said, I've also seen an increase in the number of individuals who are older than I am getting more active on social media out of a desire, I think, to learn, to build relationships, and kind of, I would say, a tacit recognition of the fact that, social media now is a powerful tool to use for building connections, building relationships, and potentially building business as well.
And a really nice reflection back to where we started this conversation around how the mindset of this is how it's always been done, and perhaps not wanting to change, and a real shift towards people doing things slightly differently now.
Absolutely. I do think that, my one piece of advice to anyone is always be adapting and always be learning.
So, Colin, I know that you like to connect with new people. And what's the best way for lawyers who are interested in legal tech to follow you and to connect with you?
Best ways to connect with me are through 3 ways. One is through LinkedIn, where I'm easily found. 2 is on Twitter. My handle is clevy_law. And also 3, through my website, colinslevy.com. Which features a blog that highlights leaders in the legal tech and legal innovation spaces.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much for your time. It's been fascinating talking to you.
Thank you very much.
That was Claire Rason talking to Colin Levy, corporate lawyer and legal tech evangelist. And Claire is with me now. So, Claire, what really jumped out for you during that conversation?
So there were a couple of things. I think one of the things that really jumped out at me was this duty of tech competence, which is, I have to admit, not something that I had come across before, and something that, surprised me, delighted me, I think, possibly in equal measure.
But I can be sure that it won't delight many established lawyers, particularly in the UK, where that notion of using tech in their daily working lives is something that's very new to them.
Yeah, and I think what it shows is how legal tech is now not a negotiable. I think lawyers need to use technology. I think lawyers do use technology, and what's nice about the duty is it really does put it at the heart of what lawyers in the US have to think about, and I think raises its importance, which is perhaps why it's so powerful. And kind of the other thing that came out from our conversation, which is tied to that, I guess, is this idea around multidisciplinary teams and who is best placed to decide on the technology, who is best placed to use the technology, and is that lawyers, or is it someone who's an expert in tech who's brought in to work alongside the lawyers in a multidisciplinary team? That's
right, and I suppose what it's forcing on lawyers is to always have at top of their mind, what's the best toolkit I can have to bring the best possible service to my clients? And in some way, inevitably, it's making lawyers more client-centric than possibly they've ever been.
I agree.
Claire, I really enjoyed that episode. Thanks ever so much for bringing it to us.
No problem. And I understand that for the next episode, you are going to be joined by Will Johnson, who is General Counsel at BMW Group UK and Ireland. So I'm really looking forward to that one. Thanks to you as well for listening, and we hope you're enjoying this series of Lawyers Coach.
Lawyers Coach is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. If you're enjoying this series, please rate us on your podcast provider so that others can find us. If you're a lawyer and would like to take part in Lawyers Coach, please visit our website lawyercoach.co.uk for further details. And you can also join the conversation on our LinkedIn group Lawyers Coach. If there are any topics you'd like to hear us discuss, then just get in touch.